Title: My boss turned out to be my long-lost father. When I got the job, I was beyond excited. It was my first real role in a reputable company, and the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward for years. But on the first day, I was introduced to my boss, a stern man named Greg, who didn't seem all that friendly. He was tall, intimidating, with a sharp gaze that felt like it could see right through me. He barely looked up when I walked in, just muttered a quick welcome and handed me a stack of files to review. I remember thinking, great. Just my luck to end up with the most intense boss in the company. Greg was demanding and relentless. Every day, he pushed me harder, always finding something I could improve or do better. I would put my heart into a project, only for him to pick apart every detail, sometimes leaving me feeling frustrated and drained. I'd go home wondering what I'd done to deserve such harsh treatment from a boss I barely knew. But then, strange things started happening. I'd noticed Greg giving me these weird looks during meetings, almost like he was studying me. Once, I caught him staring at me across the conference table, and I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to his usual intensity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One day, while I was organizing a pile of old files in his office, I came across a picture on his desk. It was an old, faded photo of a woman and a little boy. The woman looked vaguely familiar, and I remember feeling a strange pang in my chest when I saw it. Craig walked in and saw me looking at it. He stiffened, quickly snatched the photo, and placed it in his drawer. That's private, he said curtly, his tone cold and defensive. The encounter left me feeling uneasy. There was something about that photo, something that felt oddly familiar. That night, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I started to remember flashes of my childhood, the faint memory of a man who had once been in my life, but had disappeared without explanation. My MOM had always been vague whenever I asked about him, only saying he wasn't ready to be a father. I had stopped asking after a while, convincing myself I didn't need to know. But now, looking at Greg, I started to wonder. I dismissed the thought. It seemed impossible, far too coincidental, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at me, making me question everything. Could it really be him? The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. I couldn't stop myself from analyzing everything Greg said, every look he gave me, searching for signs, clues, anything to confirm or deny what I suspected. I knew I couldn't just ask him outright. If I was wrong, it would be embarrassing beyond words, but if I was right, it would change everything. One day, I stayed late, working on a project that Greg had assigned. Everyone else had left, and the office was quiet. Greg came over, glanced at my work, and gave a quick nod. Good job, he said. It was the first compliment he'd given me since I started, and for a second, I saw a softer look in his eyes, something almost paternal. Before I could stop myself, I blurted out, Greg, do you have kids? He looked taken aback, his usual cool demeanor slipping for a moment. Why do you ask? He replied, his voice guarded. I don't know, just curious, I said, trying to play it off. He paused, as if considering whether or not to answer. I had a son, a long time ago, he said quietly, looking down at the floor, but we haven't spoken in years. My heart started pounding. I could barely breathe. It felt like the pieces of a puzzle were falling into place, but I didn't want to believe it. I thanked him and quickly left the office. Feeling dazed that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, filled with memories of my childhood, of a man who had been there one day and gone the next. The next morning, I couldn't hold back any longer. I went into Greg's office, closed the door, and took a deep breath. Greg, this is going to sound crazy, but I have to ask, did you have a family years ago? A wife named Linda? And a son? His face went pale. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and recognition. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other, the weight of the realization hanging in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Yes. Yes, I did. A flood of emotions hit me all at once: anger, hurt, confusion. Why did you leave? I demanded, my voice shaking. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without a father? Watching my MOM struggle every day? He looked away, his face edged with regret. I wasn't ready. I was young, scared, selfish, he admitted, his voice filled with guilt. I thought I'd ruin your lives if I stayed. So, I left, thinking it was the best thing for everyone. But I was wrong. I wanted to yell, to tell him he had no right to come back into my life, even unknowingly, after all these years. But the pain in his eyes stopped me. I could see that he was carrying his own burden, his own regret. Over the next few days, things were
awkward, to say the least. Working with him, knowing he was my father, felt surreal. He started making small attempts to reach out, inviting me to lunch, asking about my interests, even trying to offer advice. I resisted at first, not wanting to let him in, but part of me
wanted to know him, to understand why he made the choices he had.
One day, after a particularly stressful meeting, Greg pulled me aside. Listen, I know I don't have the right to ask, but I'd like to get to know you, if you'd let me. I was silent for a moment, torn between anger and a strange, undeniable longing to understand him. You left me, I said quietly, my voice filled with hurt. You left us. I know, he replied, his voice choked with emotion, and I've regretted it every day. But maybe we can start over. I can't change the past, but I want to be here now, if you'll let me. There was sincerity in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I decided to give him a chance, unsure of where it would lead, but willing to take the first step. In the months that followed, our relationship was a mix of highs and lows. Sometimes we'd have great conversations, moments where it felt like we could really understand each other. Other times, old wounds would resurface, leading to tense arguments, reminders of the years we'd lost. But slowly, we found common ground. He shared stories from his life, explained the mistakes he'd made, and over time, I began to see him not just as the father who had left, but as a flawed person trying to make amends.
One evening, we went to dinner, just the two of us.
Halfway through, he looked at me and said, I know I can't fix the past, but I want you to know that I am proud of you. You've become someone incredible, despite everything. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting of my shoulders. I realized that I had been carrying anger and resentment for so long, but his acknowledgement allowed me to let some of it go. Eventually, I found a balance, accepting him for who he was, both the man who had hurt me and the one trying to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were two people, connected by blood, but separated by years of pain, finally finding a way to move forward. Looking back, I never would have imagined that my boss could turn out to be my father, or that we could somehow build something meaningful from the ashes of the past.
It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but in the end, I found something I hadn't expected: closure, understanding, and, maybe for the first time, peace.
Starting my new job was supposed to be exciting, a fresh beginning in a respected company, but the introduction to my boss, Greg, had me feeling uneasy right from the start. Greg was stern, almost cold, with a sharp, piercing gaze that made me feel like he could see right through me. His welcome was brief and barely a glance in my direction before he handed me a stack of work and walked away. As the weeks went on, I realized that his demeanor wasn't just an impression. Greg was demanding and relentless. Every project I worked on was picked apart with ruthless precision, every detail scrutinized. At first, I thought he just had high standards, but as time passed, I started to wonder why he was so hard on me specifically. It was as if nothing I did was good enough. I went home most nights feeling exhausted, questioning my abilities, and then I began to notice something strange. He'd give me these long, searching looks during
meetings or while passing by my desk. One time, I caught him staring at me across the conference room table. When I looked back, he quickly glanced away, pretending to focus on the papers in front of him. It was unsettling, but I couldn't make sense of it.
One day, while organizing files in his office, I noticed an old photo on his desk. It was of a woman and a little boy. The woman looked vaguely familiar. And as I stared at the photo, I felt a pang of something unexplainable, an odd sense of recognition that left me shaken just then. Greg walked in and saw me looking at the photo. His face tightened, and he snatched the picture from my hand. His voice icy. That's personal, he said, tucking it away in his drawer. I left his office with a sense of unease, but the image of that woman stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. That night, flashes of my early childhood surfaced, faint, fuzzy memories of a man who'd once been in my life, but had disappeared without a trace. My mother had never spoken much about him, only saying that he wasn't ready, and leaving it at that. I didn't press her. I'd grown up without a father, and over time, I'd come to accept it. But now, looking back at Greg's face and that photo, the memory started stirring in a way that left me unsettled. For weeks, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. But every time Greg looked at me with those intense, scrutinizing eyes, I couldn't help but wonder, could he really be?
No, it seemed impossible.
Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I started paying closer attention, trying to catch any clues, however subtle. Then, one evening, as I worked late on a project, Greg came by my desk. He seemed tired, almost weary, as he looked over my work. After a moment, he nodded slightly. "Good job," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd given me any kind of positive feedback, and for a second, I thought I saw a softness in his expression, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Before I knew what I was saying, I blurted out, "Do you have kids?" He looked taken aback, his usual cool composure slipping for a moment. "Why do you ask?" he replied cautiously, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know. Just curious," I mumbled, trying to play it off. I didn't want him to suspect the thoughts swirling in my mind. After a long pause, he sighed, almost as if he'd been waiting for this question. "I had a son a long time ago, but we haven't spoken in years," he said softly, his gaze dropping to the floor. My heart started racing. I felt dizzy, a mix of emotions churning inside me. Was this it? Was Greg?
Was he my father? I thanked him quickly and practically ran out of the office, too overwhelmed to process what had just happened.
That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories and emotions clashed in my mind, forcing me to confront a possibility I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination. I couldn't go on like this, drowning in questions and uncertainties.
I needed to know the truth.
Taking a deep breath, I walked into his office, closed the door, and looked him straight in the eye. "Greg, I need to ask you something personal," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Did you have a family years ago? A wife named Linda?
And
A son?"
he stared at me, his face going pale, eyes wide with shock. We stood there in silence, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Finally, he took a deep breath and nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I did." I felt a wave of anger, sadness, and disbelief wash over me. "So you're my father?"
I said, the words sounding surreal even as I spoke them.
He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't plan this," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I left because
I was young, scared, and selfish. I thought I'd ruin your lives if I stayed."
I could barely contain my emotions. "Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without you? Watching MOM struggle?"
Wondering why I wasn't worth staying for. My voice cracked, and I could feel the anger and hurt I'd buried for years rising to the surface.
"I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I can't change the past. I've lived with that regret every day. But seeing you now..."
It's like fate brought us back together. I took a shaky breath, my mind reeling from the revelation. Part of me wanted to run, to shut him out forever, but another part of me
wanted answers. I wanted to understand why he made the choices he had, even if it didn't take away the pain.
The days that followed were tense, filled with awkward interactions and mixed emotions. Greg started reaching out, trying to get to know me, asking about my interests, even offering advice on work projects. At first, I resisted, keeping my walls up, but I could see that he was genuinely trying, that he wanted to build something from the broken pieces of our past. One afternoon, he invited me to lunch. We sat in a quiet
CAF.
surrounded by strangers, both of us struggling to find the right words. After a long silence, he looked at me and said, "I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like a chance to get to know you, not as your boss, but as
your father." Part of me was still angry, still hurt, but another part of me wanted to believe him. I nodded slowly, unsure of what this meant, but willing to give him a chance. In the months that followed, we worked through our tangled emotions. Some days were good, filled with moments where I'd catch glimpses of the father I'd always wanted. Other days, old wounds resurfaced, leading to tense conversations and painful memories. But despite the ups and downs, I began to see him not just as the man who'd
left, but as a flawed person trying to make amends. One evening, as we shared a quiet dinner, he looked at me and said, "I know I can't fix the past, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You've become someone incredible." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting of my shoulders. I realized I'd been carrying a resentment I didn't even know was there. His acknowledgement allowed me to let go of some of that pain. In time, I found a balance, learning to accept him as both the father who had hurt me and the man trying to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were two people, connected by blood, but separated by years of pain, finally finding a way to move forward. Looking back, I never would have imagined that my boss could turn out to be my father, or that we could find something meaningful after all those years of silence. It was a journey I hadn't asked for, but one I was grateful to have taken.
Weeks went by, and my relationship with Greg continued to evolve. The initial shock of discovering that my boss was my estranged father had started to fade, replaced by a steady stream of complicated emotions, anger, confusion, and a strange unacknowledged sense of relief. Relief that the mystery of my past was no longer a mystery, and that, somehow, fate had thrown us back into each other's lives.
Our interactions were still awkward. I'd feel a surge of resentment every time he tried to talk to me about personal things, a reminder that he had missed out on every significant moment in my life. But gradually, I started noticing the small ways he was trying. He'd bring me coffee in the mornings, linger at my desk to check on my work, and invite me to lunch almost every other day. It felt strange, like we were trying to build a bridge across a vast emotional chasm.
And yet, I couldn't deny that part of me wanted to see where it would lead.
One afternoon, after a particularly long and frustrating workday, Greg suggested we grab a drink at a nearby bar. I hesitated, not wanting to give him any ground that felt remotely personal, but eventually I agreed. We sat at a small corner table, the dim lighting casting shadows that softened his typically stern features. He ordered a scotch, and I followed suit. Unsure how else to break the tension after a long silence, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual.
You know, I think about the day I left a lot. He began, staring into his glass. I've run through that decision in my head 1,000 times, wondering how different things might have been if I'd stayed.
I wanted to say something sharp, to ask why he hadn't reached out, why he hadn't tried to be a part of my life. But I could see the pain etched in his face, the regrets that weighed on him, and I found myself listening instead.
I was young, insecure, and terrified of failing as a father. He continued. I thought, maybe it was better for you if I wasn't around. Your mother and I were constantly fighting, and I convinced myself that my absence would be better than a life of conflict.
His words left a bitter taste in my mouth, but there was a part of me that understood. I knew what it was like to feel inadequate, to want to run from responsibility when it seemed overwhelming, but understanding didn't take away the hurt. I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. That might have been easier for you, but it wasn't easier for us, I replied. I grew up watching Emma work two jobs just to make ends meet. I'd see other kids with their fathers, and I'd wonder why you couldn't be there, why I wasn't enough to make you stay.
He looked down, visibly affected by my words. I'm sorry, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I know I can't change the past, but if there's anything I can do to make things right, I want to try. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let go of the pain that had shadowed my life, but another part of me still clung to the anger, the years of resentment that had become a part of who I was. I nodded, acknowledging his apology, but unable to say more. Over the next few months, we continued this delicate dance of getting to know each other, trying to build something real from the remnants of our past. There were moments of breakthrough times when we'd laugh over shared interests, or spend hours talking about work projects as if we were just colleagues. Then there were the setbacks.
The tense silences and accidental reminders of the years we'd lost. One afternoon, while we were reviewing a major project, Greg surprised me by asking, "Do you have any hobbies outside of work?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to care about my life beyond the office, but I decided to humor him. I like to play guitar, I admitted, a bit reluctantly. I took lessons in high school and stuck with it, to my surprise. He smiled. I used to play too, he said, his face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen before. Maybe we could jam together sometime.
I laughed, feeling a strange sense of connection. I don't know if I'm ready for that just yet, I replied, keeping the tone light. But in that moment, I felt something shift, a small crack in the walls I'd built around myself. A few weeks later, we ended up working late on a high-stakes project. It was nearly midnight, and we were both exhausted. Running on coffee and sheer willpower, as we packed up for the night, he turned to me and said, "Let's get something to eat, my treat."
We found a small 24-hour diner nearby, and as we sat down, it felt like the professional walls between us were finally starting to come down. Greg opened up about his struggles in life, admitting to past mistakes and sharing stories I'd never heard before. For the first time, I saw him not just as my absent father, but as a person, someone
who had faced challenges, fears, and regrets just like anyone else. At one point, he reached across the table, resting his hand over mine. "I know I missed out on so much," he said quietly, his eyes full of sincerity, "but I want to be here for you now, in any way I can. I looked down at his hand, feeling a surge of emotions I couldn't quite name. Slowly, I nodded. I appreciate that, I replied, my voice barely a whisper, and for the first time, I meant it.
Our relationship continued to grow, albeit slowly and with its fair share of setbacks. There were days when I'd feel a rush of anger or bitterness, reminders of the childhood I'd spent wondering about him, wishing he'd been there. But there were also days when I found myself reaching out to him not as a boss or a distant figure
From my past, but as my father. One evening, after a long day at work, I asked him if he wanted to grab dinner. He looked surprised but accepted, and we ended up at a quiet restaurant, talking late into the night as the conversation went on. I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, the struggles I'd faced growing up, the insecurities I'd battled, the dreams I'd had as a kid, and he listened, really listened, with a look
of compassion that made me feel like, just maybe, we could move past the hurt.
I know I've said it before, but I am proud of you, he said, his voice filled with warmth.
You've done so much with your life, despite everything. Hearing those words felt like a balm for my soul. It didn't erase the pain, but it softened it, helped me release a piece of the resentment I'd been carrying. By the end of the year, we built something I never thought possible. We weren't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but we had found a way to bridge the gap. He'd become more than just my boss, he'd become my father again, in a way I'd never imagined. Looking back, I realized that the journey wasn't just about finding my father. It was about finding peace within myself. I'd learned to let go of the bitterness, to see him not as the man who'd abandoned me, but as someone who had made mistakes and was trying to make amends, and that, I realized, was enough.
After that night at the diner, something shifted between Greg and me. There was still awkwardness, of course, a residual tension that seemed inevitable after so many years apart, but slowly, the walls between us began to crumble. We started talking more, not just about work, but about life outside of the office.
One day, Greg surprised me by inviting me to his home for dinner. He said he wanted to show me where he lived and what he was really like outside of work. I hesitated at first. The idea of entering his private life felt surreal, almost impersonal. But I realized that if I wanted to understand him, I needed to see him as more than just the man who'd hurt me.
When I arrived, I was taken aback by how simple and unassuming his house was. I'd expected something cold and meticulously organized, like his office, but his home was warm and cozy, filled with old books, family photos, and little signs of the life he'd built.
There was a photo of him and a golden retriever on the mantel, a picture of him hiking with friends, and even an old guitar propped up in the corner. For the first time, I saw Greg as a real person, someone who had lived a life completely separate from mine.
During dinner, he seemed nervous, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. We started with light conversation, talking about work and the projects we were tackling. But as the night wore on, our conversation turned deeper, touching on his past, his regrets, and the choices that had led him here.
I want you to know, there hasn't been a single day I didn't think about you, he admitted quietly, looking down at his plate. I kept telling myself that leaving was the right thing to do, that it would make things easier for you and your MOM. But I was wrong, and I know I can't undo that. There was a heaviness in his voice that I hadn't heard before, a vulnerability that took me by surprise. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it was okay, that I was fine, but I knew that wasn't true. The pain was still there, even if I had buried it. I took a deep breath. You know, for a long time, I thought I didn't need a father, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I told myself that I was better off without you, that I could be strong on my own. But now,
seeing you here, listening to you,
I don't know what to think anymore.
Greg reached across the table, his hand resting on mine. You don't have to forgive me, he said softly, but I want you to know that I'm here now, and if you ever need anything at all, I'll be here.
Our relationship continued to grow slowly, like a fragile plant taking root after a long winter. I began to feel comfortable enough to call him occasionally outside of work, just to talk. Sometimes I'd ask him about his life, his experiences, even his regrets. Other times, I'd share things from my own life, small victories, dreams I had never shared with anyone else. One afternoon, while we were working on a presentation, Greg surprised me with a gift. It was a new guitar, simple yet beautiful, with a note that read, "For all the music we never got to play together." I was speechless, staring at the guitar with a mix of shock and gratitude.
I thought, maybe we could play sometime, he said, his voice tentative, almost shy, if you're up for it. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'd like that. I managed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through me. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me.
For the first time, I felt like we were building something real, something tangible, piece by piece. That weekend, I brought the guitar to his house, and we spent hours playing together. He taught me old songs he used to play, and I showed him a few riffs I'd picked up over the years. The music bridged the gap between us, creating a bond that words alone couldn't in those moments. We weren't just father and son. We were two people connecting through something we both loved. But our journey wasn't without setbacks. There were days when old wounds resurfaced, painful reminders of the years we'd lost. One evening, during a family gathering at his house, I felt a surge of resentment seeing him interact so naturally with his friends. I realized he had built a life, a community, and that I'd never been
Part of it. The anger bubbled up, and without thinking, I pulled him aside.
Do you know what it's like to feel like a stranger in your own father's life?
I demanded, my voice tinged with bitterness. You had all these years to be a part of mine, but you chose to walk away, and now…
Now I'm supposed to just accept that?
Greg's face fell, his eyes filled with remorse. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said softly, and I don't expect it, but I'm trying. And I'm here now. I want to be here, for however long you'll let me. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was one we needed in the days that followed. I started to
let go of some of the anger, realizing that it was only holding me back. Greg wasn't perfect, he never had been, but he was trying to make things right, and that was more than I'd ever expected. A year after we'd reconnected, Greg and I went on a camping trip together. It was his idea, a way for us to escape from work and the city, to spend time together without the pressures of our past hanging over us as we sat by the campfire, under a sky filled with stars. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, one of quiet pride. "You've become an incredible person," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm grateful that I get to be part of your life, even if it's only now." Those words stayed with me long after that night. I realized that he wasn't just my father. He was someone who had been lost, just like me, trying to find his way back.
We were both healing, both learning to accept the past for what it was. In the months that followed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. We weren't just father and son trying to reconnect.
We were two people creating something entirely new. The pain of the past had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding, a bond built on forgiveness and acceptance. Looking back, I knew that our journey was far from conventional, but it was ours. We had found each other after years of separation, learning to navigate the complexities of family, regret, and redemption, and in that, I found something I hadn't expected: closure, love, and, maybe for the first time, a sense of belonging.
Wanted to introduce me to someone from his life, his closest friend, Roger. Greg mentioned Roger often in passing, talking about their decades-long friendship and how they'd supported each other through tough times. Greg said he'd told Roger about our reunion, that Roger had been one of the few people who knew about me from the
beginning. It was strange to think that someone else had known about my existence, even if they'd never met me. When I arrived, Roger greeted me with a warm, welcoming smile. He was in his 60s, with graying hair and a hearty laugh that filled the room. He seemed genuinely happy to meet me, and it was clear from the start that he cared deeply about Greg. As we sat around the dinner table, Roger began sharing stories about Greg from years before.
He painted a picture of a man who was young, overwhelmed, and struggling to figure out his place in the world. Greg was always a complicated guy, Roger said with a chuckle, giving Greg a friendly pat on the shoulder. "But he's got a good heart. I remember him telling me about you when you were just a baby, saying he'd never loved anyone the way he loved you. That scared him, I think. He didn't know if he'd be a good father, and he was afraid of messing things up."
Hearing this from Roger's perspective brought a new level of understanding. Greg had never said these things to me directly, and maybe he never would. But hearing it secondhand allowed me to see a side of him that was hidden beneath his guilt and regret. I could see the mixture of pride and vulnerability on Greg's face, and in that
moment, I realized he had spent his life carrying the weight of his past mistakes, hoping one day he'd have the chance to make things right.
As the night went on, Roger told more stories, weaving humor and warmth into each one. I found myself laughing, feeling at ease in a way I hadn't expected. It was a small but powerful reminder that sometimes healing doesn't come from the people who hurt us directly, but from those around them who help us see a bigger picture. Later, as we said our goodbyes, Roger pulled me aside. "I just want you to know Your dad talks about you all the time, he said, his tone soft and sincere. He may not say it, but he's proud of you, and he's grateful you're giving him this chance. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Thank you, Roger, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper, and in that moment, I felt a sense of peace, as if a piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. In the weeks that followed, Greg and I started spending time together outside of work, finding small ways to connect. Sometimes we'd go to baseball games, reliving the experiences I'd missed as a child. Other times, we'd grab coffee on Sunday mornings, talking about everything from our favorite movies to the books we were reading. Slowly, he started to feel less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged in my life. One afternoon, Greg invited me to help him clean out his attic. As we sifted through dusty boxes and old belongings, we came across a box labeled Memories. Inside were photographs, letters, and mementos from his past. Among them, I found a small, faded picture of myself as a toddler, grinning and holding a toy car. Seeing it took me by surprise, as I hadn't realized he'd kept anything from my childhood. Greg looked over my shoulder, a gentle smile crossing his face. I used to carry that photo in my wallet, he said quietly. I'd take it out whenever I felt like I couldn't keep going. You were my motivation, even if I wasn't there. I looked down at the photo, a swirl of emotions running through me. For so long, I'd assumed he'd left and never looked back. But holding that picture, seeing the way he'd kept a piece of me with him all these years, gave me a new perspective. I used to wish you'd come back, I admitted, my voice shaky. Every birthday, every holiday, I'd wonder if you'd ever come home. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with regret. I am sorry I wasn't there. I was a coward. I thought you'd be better off without me. But I see now that I was wrong. We stood there in silence, the weight of our shared pain heavy between us.
But instead of anger, I felt a sense of understanding, a feeling that maybe we could start to heal, not just as father and son, but as two people trying to make peace with the past. A few months later, as our relationship grew stronger, Greg invited me to a family gathering, a reunion of sorts with relatives I'd never met. At first, I was hesitant. Meeting family members I'd never known felt overwhelming, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But Greg assured me that it would be casual, just a chance for me to see the bigger family I hadn't known I had. When I arrived, I was welcomed with open arms by cousins, aunts, and uncles, people who greeted me like they'd known me my whole life. They shared stories, asked questions, and treated me as if I'd always been a part of their lives. For the first time, I felt the warmth and support of a family I'd never known, and I realized that I hadn't just gained a father, I had gained an entire community. During the reunion, I had a quiet moment with Greg. He looked at me, a mixture of pride and joy on his face. You belong here, he said simply, this family. It was always yours. I felt a wave of gratitude, not just for him, but for everyone who had embraced me, who had welcomed me into this family without hesitation. And in that moment, I knew that the journey we'd taken, as painful and challenging as it had been, was worth it. I was no longer a stranger to my own family. I had found my place, my identity, and the sense of belonging I had craved for so long. By the end of that year, Greg and I had built a relationship that was far from perfect, but it was real. We had learned to laugh together, to share our lives, and to support each other in ways I never thought possible. I'd come to see him not just as the man who had left, but as someone who had struggled, made mistakes, and ultimately found the courage to return. Looking back, I realized that our journey had been about more than just reconnecting. It was about healing, about forgiveness, and about finding the strength to let go of the past. In building a new relationship with Greg, I had also built a new relationship with myself, learning to accept the person I had become. Our story wasn't conventional, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours, and in the end, I found something I hadn't expected: peace, family, and a sense of wholeness that had been missing for far too long. A year and a half after discovering that Greg was my father, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. It was a transformation I hadn't expected, one that had brought about growth, understanding, and a healing I hadn't thought possible. Greg and I had developed a bond built not only on forgiveness, but on shared experiences. The kind that only comes when both people are willing to confront their past and work towards something new. One day, he surprised me by asking if I would consider coming to a small, informal family gathering at his home. This time, it wasn't about work or reconnecting over missed time. It was a simple barbecue. Just family and close friends. I knew this invitation was his way of showing that he saw me as part of his life now, not as an outsider, or even just as his son, but as family. When I arrived, the backyard was filled with laughter and the smell of barbecue. I was greeted with warm smiles, hugs, and conversations, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged. Craig was in his element, flipping burgers, laughing with relatives, and sharing stories with friends who had known him for years. It was a side of him I hadn't seen often, a side that showed me how much he had grown too. At one point, he called me over and put an arm around my shoulders, a proud smile on his face. "Everyone," he announced, "this is my son. He's back in my life, and I'm grateful every day for it." The pride and love in his voice made my heart swell. It was a moment I never could have imagined when this journey started. I looked around at the people surrounding us, people who welcomed me without question, and I realized that this was the family I had longed for. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the years of pain and absence, but it was real, and that was enough. After everyone left, Greg and I sat together in his backyard, watching the sunset, both of us wrapped in a comfortable silence. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was missing something. I was whole. "Thank you for giving me a second chance," Greg said quietly, looking at me with genuine gratitude. I smiled, feeling a weight lift as I spoke. "Thank you for coming back and fighting to be here. I think we both needed this." He nodded, and we sat there until the stars came out. The unspoken understanding between us stronger than any words could express. We had faced the past, made peace with it, and built a future together, and in the process, I had found the family I had always needed, not just in him, but in myself. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of rediscovery, forgiveness, and family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss more inspiring stories like this. What would you have done in the protagonist's shoes? Would you have given a second chance or walked away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, life can surprise us in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes the path to healing starts with just one conversation. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories of resilience, hope, and life's incredible twists. Until next time, take care and remember, it's never too late to find forgiveness and create a new beginning.